This summer, I'm leading some of my high school students through one of my favorite books of the Bible of all time, the Song of Solomon, also known as the Song of Songs, as we explore what it looks like to pursue relationships, love, and romance from a godly perspective, and basically just trying to do love right. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to share those lessons with y'all. Not because I think that I have anything particularly notable to share on the subject, but because I think that this book is something that we should be studying more. And so that's what we're going to do. The video you're about to see is actually an introduction video that I shared with my students so that they can hopefully watch that before we meet up for the first time in person. And that's mainly because whenever we meet up, I'm wanting us to just dive straight into the book. And so this video covers the introductory materials when it comes to the song. And so as you're watching it, it might seem like I'm talking to people who I'm going to meet up with in person. That's because that's exactly what's going to happen. And then in the weeks to come, rather than posting me and their meetups, Brianne and I are going to be coming in here and we are actually going to be sharing with you basically a summary and probably a little verse by verse exposition of the song based off of the things that we've talked about with our students. And so that's basically what this is. This is the first video in that series. I hope that you're excited to talk about this song because it is, like I said, one of my favorite books of the Bible that I think we should be talking about more, but I wanted this to be a very brief introduction, so let's get to the video itself. Let's get to the video itself. That's what I meant to say. Let's do it. All right, guys. So this summer, we are going to be going through the book, The Song of Solomon, also known as the Song of Songs. And what I wanted to do in this video is give us a brief introduction to the book as a whole. Because whenever we meet up in person on Mondays at 4 p.m., I really want us to just dive right into the book without having to do a lot of introductory material. And so this video is for those of y'all who really want to go more in depth into the book. And also I want to explain why we're going through this book. I'll explain some of this whenever we're in person, but whenever we meet up, I really want us to be able to just dive right in so you can get the most out of the book without me having to spend an entire week just doing introductory stuff. And so that's what we're doing in this video. And the first thing that I need to address is, why are we going through this book? One of the reasons is because it's one of my favorite books of the Bible. Another reason is because a lot of y'all asked to go through this book. But the number one reason why we're going to be going through this book is because I think this is something that we need to be studying more as a church, because not many people are going through this book a lot. And I don't see a lot of Bible studies going through this, especially with teenagers. But I can tell you, through studying this book, I would have been saved from so much grief if somebody had just taught me what this book said when I was younger. And I would have been saved so much relationship drama and so much relationship issues and so much worldliness if somebody had just taught me the principles of this book when I was your age. And so I'm hoping that I can help you avoid the mistakes I've made. And I'm hoping that I can help you learn how to pursue relationships from a godly perspective, because unfortunately, the church has kind of failed you in that regard, because a lot of the times we get so embarrassed to talk about these things that all of y'all are probably going through and that all of us go through, that you end up going into this deep and intimate thing called romance and relationships, and you don't have much guidance from the church. And what guidance we do often provide is more fear tactics and stuff to make you afraid of these things, to where you almost feel guilty for even being attracted to somebody. And I don't think that's how the Bible wants you to feel. I think that the Bible has a very beautiful portrait to paint of romance and of pursuing somebody and of marriage and even of sex. The Bible is actually very positive whenever it comes to sex, but we need to address it from a godly perspective. And that's why I want to go through this book, because if somebody had just taught me these things when I was younger, it would have helped me approach relationships from a godly perspective that I only had to learn later on in life. And so I'm hoping that will be the number one takeaway you have from this. But also beyond that, that's not to say that we can't learn anything about God from this, because ultimately we have to remember, and I'm going to talk about this again in a little bit, but ultimately marriage is meant to paint a picture of our relationship with God. And so not only will we learn how to pursue one another in a godly perspective, but we'll also learn how to pursue God, how he wants to be pursued, and we'll learn more about how he pursues us. And so I think there's so much we could learn from this book, and that's why it is one of my favorite books, if not my single most favorite book in the Bible. And it's because there's so much to learn, and it's also just a beautiful story, and we're going to talk about that as we go through this. I'm hoping that by the end of this study, it will become one of your favorite books as well. And I'm hoping that you will return to it every single time, and you'll fall in love with the story again and again and again, and that you will leave this study having a godly perspective of relationships that leaves you rejoicing at the idea of pursuing a future spouse in a godly, respectable manner. And so that's the number one thing. But we'll talk more about that in a second. Let's do the introductory details. First off, background info. I'm going to introduce this the same way that we introduced all the books whenever we went through it throughout the year. Author. The author of this book is most likely Solomon. And if you know anything about Solomon, he was the son of King David, the third king of Israel. The Bible tells us in 1 Kings that he wrote 1,005 songs, but this song right here is his Shir HaSharim, his Song of Songs. We don't have any of the other songs of Solomon in the Bible other than one psalm in the book of Psalms. But this song of all the 1,000 songs he wrote is considered the top song that he wrote. And you got to keep in mind, this guy was the wisest and richest person in the world at that time. And he wrote this song, and the Bible calls it the song to beat all songs. Think about how many songs there are in the Bible. This song is the Song of Songs. Some people will debate whether or not Solomon was actually the author of it, and ultimately it doesn't matter. I believe that it does tell the story of Solomon pursuing somebody. We'll talk about that in a second. But I do also typically lean towards the idea that Solomon is the one who wrote it. In Hebrew, wherever it says in the first verse, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, in Hebrew, that phrase, which is Solomon's, could mean which is for Solomon, which is of Solomon, which is to Solomon. And so people debate whether or not he wrote it or whether it was simply written about him or for him. Ultimately, I lean towards the idea that it was written by him and he's recounting his story for future generations. The date, assuming Solomon was the author, would be between 970 and 930 BC because those are the years that Solomon reigned over Israel, and it seems like this book was written while he was still king. While it records events that are taking place earlier in Solomon's reign, it could have been written at any point. I do believe that the story it recounts is of a young Solomon, maybe even a teenage or early 20s Solomon. I don't really know his exact age at this point, but I think this is telling a story from early on in Solomon's reign, but the letter, like the song itself, could have actually been written much later on for all I know. And so we really don't know an exact date for this book, whereas whenever we get to like some of Paul's letters and stuff in the New Testament, we have pretty fixed dates. Not the case with the Song of Songs. The genre is love poetry and wisdom literature, right? This is a collection of love songs, which is really, really cool because I bet some of y'all might not have even known that the Bible has a book that is a collection of love songs right there. And it's really beautiful. And these are genuinely the most beautiful love songs I have ever read. Shakespeare has got nothing on the Song of Solomon. That's why it's called the Song of Songs. It is the song that surpasses all songs, including all the songs that you find in the Bible. It's also a piece of wisdom literature, right? This goes along with the books like Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes because it is trying to teach you wisdom and how to conduct your life in a godly manner in a rubber meets the road type of way, right? Proverbs is filled with nuggets of wisdom and just day-to-day activities all around. The book of Job gives you nuggets of wisdom in regards to how to deal with pain and suffering and reconcile a good God in the midst of an evil world. You get to Ecclesiastes and it gives you nuggets of information on how to go about life in a meaningful way where you're not just wasting your life away. And Song of Solomon teaches us how to pursue this intimate thing called love and how to pursue relationships and how to pursue marriage. And that's what this book is all about. And we're going to talk about this momentarily. Some people interpret this book in a million different ways, right? And some people try to take away the fact that this book is about marriage. And I think that's a big issue because if this book is about marriage, then the actual instructions that we have about marriage in the Bible are very limited, which seems very odd to me because we have so many instructions in the Bible about how masters should treat their slaves and parents should treat their kids. But then you have this very intimate relationship called marriage, which is literally the most intimate relationship you can have other than the relationship with you and God. And many people would suggest that God basically just said, hey, I'm going to give you this amazing thing where two people become one flesh. Go figure it out for yourself. I don't think that God would do that. And so whenever I see this book, it's got to be what it presents itself as. It is a book that teaches us how to have a godly love life. And so that's exactly what this is, and it is teaching us wisdom in that regard, and that's absolutely beautiful. Other notable facts about this, along with Ruth, Esther, Ecclesiastes, and Lamentations, this belongs to what the Jewish people called the Megillot, which just means 5 scrolls, and those 5 scrolls are read at different feasts throughout the year, different holy days for the Jewish people. This one is read particularly during Passover, and that's because, historically speaking, Jewish people have also read an allegorical perspective into the Song of Solomon, where they view this, we're going to talk about this momentarily. I keep saying that. They view this story as not just detailing the relationship between a man and a woman, but the relationship between God and Israel, and they will actually tie it directly to the story of God delivering Israel, his bride, out of bondage in Egypt. And so they'll read this during Passover to celebrate that event. Another thing is that this book never mentions God by name, except for possibly in chapter 8, verse 6, at the very end of the book. And that's very interesting. There are very few books in the Bible that never mention God, but Song of Solomon is one of those. That's not to say that God's not to be found in the book. He's just never directly mentioned. And that's very interesting. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because I don't want this video to be super long. But it's interesting to me that you can have an entire book of the Bible that doesn't mention God, yet God is still evident in every single page. And we're going to see that as we go through this over the course of the next few weeks. But let's move on. Let's talk about the interpretive issues, because that is the main thing I really needed to address here, because I wanted to clarify my perspective in it going into it. And that's because over the centuries, people have debated how to properly interpret the song. This is kind of like Revelation, right? Because whenever we went through the other books, Ephesians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, people don't really have difficulty when it comes to interpreting those because everybody agrees on their genre, everybody agrees what they're about. People will just debate about maybe what different instructions mean inside of them, right? Whenever people approach the Gospels, it's very evident what the Gospels are trying to do. They're telling the story of Jesus. Whenever you go to Genesis, it's evident what Genesis is doing. But Song of Solomon is like Revelation in the fact that when people get to it, they get really weird, right? When people get to Revelation, they get all funky and they start interpreting things. And my way of interpreting Song of Solomon is the same way I interpret Revelation. I've told you this many times. I'm a simple person. I try to take things at face value as much as possible. And what you see before you is what you get. When Revelation says it is there to reveal Christ and tell of things yet to come, that's what I believe it's about. It is to reveal Christ and tell of things yet to come. And so I believe it's talking about future events. When the Song of Solomon says that it is presenting itself as a story of a man and a woman, I view it as being a story of a man and a woman. But people disagree with that. And so, not everybody disagrees with this. I'm not saying that I'm like the only person who interprets it this way. My perspective is a very common perspective. But I do want to share with you some of the other interpretations just so you're aware of them and you're not going into this thinking that I am telling you the only interpretation. I just like to be honest there. And so let's talk about some of the interpretations. One is the allegorical approach to this song. Some people have argued that the song has no historical basis whatsoever, but is entirely allegorical. And believe it or not, this was actually the predominant view for most of interpretive history. But the main reason why people interpret it this way is because of a historical discomfort over the sensual imagery found in the book. I'm going to be entirely honest with you right now. This book gets sensual and borderline erotic at some places. It talks about breasts, it talks about sex, it talks about all that sorts of stuff. And historically speaking, people have been very uncomfortable with literature like that being found in the Bible, because sometimes I think that the church and also religious people in general have not always had the best relationship with how they should handle sex. And a positive side of this is that that's changing. And over the course of the last few hundred years, people have begun to realize that you have to force this book to be allegorical because there's nothing within the book that actually makes itself allegorical. The only reason you would land at this being an allegory is if you're uncomfortable with the Bible talking about sex, which I don't think we should be, because God gave us sex and he gave us marriage. And so it makes sense that God would have instructions and he would give us wisdom in how to conduct those things. And so I don't agree with this approach, but I just wanted to make you aware of the fact that this is a common approach, and it was the most common approach for many, many centuries. And there's really two main perspectives of this. From Jewish people, they would say that it represents God and Israel, and then Christians later on, just picking up from this, they would say it represents Christ and the church, right? And then that's not to say it doesn't necessarily also represent God and Israel. They would just say they'd pick it up and say that this is Christ and the church, mainly because the Bible talks about Christ being the groom, us being the bride. And so you could see where that allegory would come in there, but there's nothing within the book itself that would suggest it's allegory. And so you have to kind of go into that assuming it in order to read it that way. Another way that people approach it, and this is getting to where I land, this is the direct approach, right? Others argue that the song should be interpreted at face value, in which case the song depicts God's ideals for love, marriage, and marital intimacy. right? And this is where I land. However, I'm going to take it a step further, and we're going to see that on the next slide. But even within this direct approach, where you are approaching it and you are saying this is a love song about two people who are just absolutely in love with one another, even then, people do take it different ways. There are two primary interpretations people take. There's the three-person interpretation and the two-person interpretation, and it mainly comes down to the lovers involved in this story. Because whenever you read the song, you're going to see that there's a woman who sings and there's a man who sings, and some people would argue that there's also a third man who sings. And we're going to talk about my perspective in a second, but in general, this is the perspectives, right? The three-person perspective suggests that the three main characters are the shepherd, the Shulamite, that's the main woman, and King Solomon, right? The shepherd, the Shulamite, and Solomon. And they're going to suggest that what happens in this story is actually a tragedy. You have this woman named the Shulamite who falls in love with a shepherd boy, but then lustful King Solomon swoops in and steals the woman away. And they actually go in some interesting ways there, because they would say that the song is actually more about the devotion of love than the actual covenant of love. And to me, that is very weird, and I'm not willing to go there because I don't see anything about that biblically in other books of the Bible. But I also don't think that that is the most natural reading of the text either. The main reason people arrive at that one is because they're trying to reconcile the fact that Solomon was not necessarily the greatest dude when it came to women. By the end of his life, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And so whenever you approach this song, and you see that this is presenting God's ideal of marriage, and Solomon is one of the key figures, some people read the other stuff we know about Solomon into the story, and they say, ooh, well, we know Solomon's not good with women, and therefore if he shows up, he must be a bad guy. I don't know if that's the correct approach either. I think we have to take the book at face value and just see what it says, and that leads me to land at the two-person interpretation, which is another common interpretation, in which case the shepherd and Solomon are actually the same person. And so, according to this interpretation, the woman falls in love with the shepherd boy, only to realize later on that he is King Solomon, and that King Solomon has actually taken her to be his bride. And yes, there's going to be difficulties that arise from that, but ultimately, the one that she fell in love with is Solomon, and he's greater than she could have ever possibly imagined. And so that's the interpretation that I am going to take, because to me, I think that is the most natural one to the text. And yeah, you still do have to reconcile the fact that Solomon was not a perfect individual, but this book isn't necessarily meant to portray Solomon in all his issues, right? It is the Song of Songs. It is presenting him in an ideal light, and some might even suggest that this is talking about his relationship with his first wife, right? And so this is actually before he fell into sin. I don't know. That really doesn't matter that much to me. I'm more concerned with just interpreting the text as it presents itself, right? And so whether or not this is just presenting Solomon in the best positive light or whatever, I don't know. I just want to interpret the text how it presents itself, and to me, I lean towards the two-person interpretation, where there are two lovers involved, a man and a woman, and that man happens to be both a shepherd and a king. There is also another interpretation, that is what we call the anthological approach, and this would just be where others suggest that the song is nothing more than a collection of various love poems, and they would suggest that it is an anthology, right? If you know what an anthology is, it is just a collection of different things that might not necessarily be directly tied together, and that's what they would suggest about the song, right? So maybe this song doesn't actually have a narrative flow and a narrative story. It's just a collection of love poetry. And that's what some people would interpret it as. I actually have this one commentary over here. This is just the sleeve, but it's called The Song of Songs by Tremper Longman III, and that's his interpretation. And you know what? That's fine. He's entitled to have that interpretation. I disagree with it. I can still learn a lot from it, but that's okay. But some people would say that there is no narrative flow to it at all. It is literally just a collection of different love poems that you can glean stuff from, but there isn't a story. I disagree with that, and I lean more towards the two-person interpretation from the direct approach, but let me tell you specifically where I land and how we're going to address it as we go into this study over the course of the next few weeks. My approach is what we're going to call the typological or typological approach. This one, like I mentioned before, it most closely aligns with the two-person interpretation. However, like I also mentioned before, since marriage was created to paint a picture of Christ and his bride, it only makes sense that a historic representation of God's ideal for marriage would ultimately picture Christ's love for his church, right? So this is kind of a way of meeting in the middle. I take the direct approach in how I interpret the song, but at the same time, I realize that if God is giving us his godly ideals for marriage, and marriage was ultimately meant to point us back to Christ, there's obviously something we can learn about our relationship with Christ and our relationship with God throughout the song as well. And so I'm not viewing it as allegorical, because in an allegory, every single component is a symbol for something else, right? So that would be, oh, well, the bride is always a symbol for the church, and the groom is always a symbol for Christ. And whenever it talks about her breasts, it is talking about something different than her breasts, right? No, I don't interpret that. Whenever it talks about the woman's breasts, I think it is talking about the woman's breasts. I just think that's how it is, right? And so I don't view it as allegorical. Rather, I view it as analogical, right? Where certain components may be comparable to greater realities, right? And so it's not that there's like a one-to-one comparison where this represents this and this represents this. That would be allegory. Instead, there's an analogy to be made, right? There are certain things that we are going to see in the song that will also give us insight into our relationship with God. That's how I approach this. And I think that that's just the most appropriate way to approach this song. And I'm not alone here, right? There are a lot of people who take this approach, and I think this is the one that is gaining more ground because people are realizing that is kind of the most natural way to approach it, because that's also how we usually approach the rest of the Bible and application itself. And so let me just tell you how I view the storyline of this song, just so you can know the greater narrative structure, how I interpret it. From my perspective, the storyline is as follows. Firstly, a Cinderella-like young maiden falls in love with a young shepherd boy. It's actually a very sweet story. Nextly, the shepherd boy courts and eventually proposes to the maiden. Thirdly, eventually the shepherd boy is revealed to be King Solomon himself. Fourthly, Solomon takes the maiden to become his queen in Jerusalem. Fifthly, the couple explores marital intimacy together, sex, conflict, growth. And then, sixthly, the song is told from the perspective of the couple who share their story in order to counsel future generations in the ways of love and romance. That's how I view this whole book. I think it is an older couple who is sharing their love story with a younger generation in order to help guide them in the ways of romance and love from a godly perspective. And that is really, really cool. And that's why I wish people would go through this book, because this book does not hold back. This book talks about how to pursue someone from a godly perspective. It talks about how to marry someone from a godly perspective, how to decide who you're going to marry, the things that you should be looking for in a spouse. But then it also talks about, and get this, it talks about sex. This is probably one of the most important things that you can take from this book, because here's the deal. You're going to learn about sex from somewhere. And I don't believe that the church is doing a good enough job in teaching us about sex from the Bible. Instead, we get embarrassed of it, we don't want to talk about it, and we just kind of throw you to the wolves, and we say, you know what, you can figure it out for yourself. But then we get mad whenever people are sinning, right? And whenever people are addicted to pornography, and people are addicted to masturbation, and people are doing all these things, and we point our fingers and wag and say, you shouldn't be doing that. Yes, you're right, you shouldn't be doing that. But the thing is, we have failed in our ability to teach you what God's desire for these things are. Instead, we have adopted this form of purity culture that is very almost legalistic in its ability to make you almost fear intimacy and fear sex. Whereas really, what we're going to see in the song is that God thinks sex is a beautiful thing at its appropriate time. And we're going to see that sex becomes beautiful at its appropriate time. And that it's not a thing to be feared, it's a thing to be enjoyed at its appropriate time. And so this book is a very sex-positive book, but in the godly way that it was meant to be. And so I think in studying this book, we'll be able to have some very honest, open conversations, and hopefully you'll feel less embarrassed to talk about this stuff, right? Because that's the issue. Sex, according to the Bible, it talks about how this is one of the most intimate things, right? This is something like sexual sins are things that are internal, right? They don't even necessarily have to be external things. And they come from inside of you. But we don't talk about them. And this is something that every single person struggles with. If you're a human being, you have probably struggled with lust. And if you were living in the 21st century, I can almost guarantee you that you have struggled with lust a lot. Because this is all around us, right? Our culture is promoting lust all around. And as Christians, we've done a very good job at saying, that's lustful, that's lustful, that's lustful, you shouldn't do it. No, no, no. But we haven't given us a godly way of handling it. And we haven't given us a godly replacement by which we can actually pursue things from a godly perspective. That's why I want to go through this book. Because in this book, we have an older couple sharing with the younger generations on how they did it right. We're going to see how the couple first met, what they talked about, what they were attracted to in one another. They're going to see how they pursued one another, how they saved themselves for the appropriate time despite the fact that their longings were strong and hard, and they had a lot of things they wanted to do, but they didn't want to awaken love prematurely. And then we are going to see them on their marriage night. And it's going to give us details, and it's going to make you blush, and it's going to make you feel uncomfortable, and you're going to feel weird talking about this with people. But you know what? I would rather talk with people about this openly in a godly biblical setting than have you go out and learn about these things from the world, because the world gets it wrong. And the world has messed us up enough, and the world has messed me up enough, and the world has messed all of us up enough. Let's let the Bible shape our perspective on romance and sex. That's what I'm wanting us to get out of this song. And that's probably the number one thing. I want us to be able to find God even in these intimate things where we're not afraid to talk about it. Okay, let me introduce you to the main characters of the song. Then I'm going to give you an outline of the book, and then we're going to wrap this up because I've already rambled on long enough. I like this book, if you can't tell. The characters. First off, there is the Shulamite, right? And I gave descriptions of this here, and I described them in the most hallmarky way possible just to entice you to study this book even more. The Shulamite is a poor, neglected girl who works her family's vineyard until she meets a man who will change her life forever. And she's going to meet this man in the opening verses of this song, and it's absolutely beautiful. And we get to see why she's attracted to this man. The Shulamite is a beautiful portrait. She's an amazing girl, and we're going to learn a lot from her. Both guys and girls can learn from this woman right here. But then there's also the shepherd, right, who I believe to be Solomon himself. He is a kind, caring, seemingly perfect boy who sweeps the Shulamite off her feet. However, there is more to him than meets the eye. And then the third group of people who are dominant throughout the book is a chorus of individuals who are known as the daughters of Jerusalem. These are the young companions of the Shulamite who rejoice in and learn from her relationship with her beloved. This is, in many ways, these girls are supposed to represent us, the reader, as we read the book and we rejoice in the love that these two people have found. And also we glean information and we glean wisdom from them as we see how they did it right and how they pursued relationships in a godly way. So those are the main characters of the book. There's some other ones who show up throughout it, but those are the main ones we're dealing with. And then I want to give you an outline, and then we'll wrap this up. All right, outline of the book. Really, there are 3 sections, and the first section is just one verse. The first section is an introduction. It says, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. It just gives you an introduction to the book, and then you go into the 2 primary sections, which are the birth of the relationship and the development of the relationship and the maturity of the relationship, right? And so the first one I've called Sowing the Seeds of Romance. As we're going to see throughout this book, it is a book filled with nature imagery. It is an outdoorsy book, and it's a very physical book, and it's a very garden imagery book. And so I put it in terms of gardening, right? Sowing the seeds of romance. The first 4 chapters of this book detail the early stages of this relationship. And then you get to the back 4 chapters. It's only 8 chapters long, very short book. You can read it in one sitting, super easy. The back 4 chapters detail what happens after the marriage, and you actually see them reaping the harvest of that romance. They planted the seeds, and then they get to reap the harvest, right? They did it right in the beginning, and then they get to do it right in the end. Let's go a little bit more in depth here. The first half of the book details their courtship and their marriage, right? So it starts off with the first really 3 chapters of the book, and these are the people just falling in love. We see their initial attraction. We kind of see dating, which is very interesting because dating was not a thing back in biblical times. But surprisingly, in this book, we get something that is very, very close to dating, which is really nice for us. This is the closest we ever get to anything in regards to dating in the Bible. And we're going to have to talk about that, how dating is a very interesting concept nowadays and how dating, we'll talk about that whenever we meet in person. But we see them falling in love, right? There's initial attraction. They date each other. They court one another. We'll talk about what courting is. And then they get betrothed. And we talked about betrothal a little bit in our class, and especially in Revelation and in 1 John and stuff. They eventually get betrothed. And that's the first 3 chapters. And then when you get to the 4th chapter, we actually skip the marriage ceremony. And we have an entire chapter talking about sex, right? And it is literally just this couple preparing to enjoy one another. And I use that word intentionally, enjoy one another. It is not simply for the purpose of making babies. These two are coming together to literally enjoy one another. And we're going to see that it is a thing to rejoice in because these people have saved themselves and they actually get to enjoy this in the proper context. And it's so, so beautiful. And so we're going to see all of that. We're going to see their courtship and ultimately the covenant they make to one another, how they are married and they give themselves to one another, belonging to one another fully. The two become one flesh. And then you get to the back half of the book, and we get to explore the relationship further. We get to see how they handle conflict in 3 of the chapters, 5, 6, and 7. We're going to see whenever they have this initial little relationship skirmish, right, where they actually have a little rupture in the relationship, and then we have to see how they reconcile ultimately, and how they pursue one another, and how they handle conflict in a godly manner, because that's another big component to how to pursue relationships. You want to know how to handle conflict well. And then they ultimately reconcile, and then that leads to the back chapter and a half of the book, where we just get to see their consistency and how, even though they're married, they continue to pursue one another. And they show how to have a healthy marriage and sex life and just romance and relationship even once you're married and even as you grow older. And the book concludes with them teaching the future generations how to do the same thing and them helping the other generations do the same thing. And that's another thing we're going to see, especially as we get to the end of this book. You don't do this in isolation, right? You can't just have a boyfriend and a girlfriend who just decide they're going to apply this book well. No, it takes a community to help one another pursue each other in a godly manner. And that's the type of community I'm hoping we'll be able to develop over the course of the summer. I'm hoping that this will be something where we can go into this book and y'all can learn what it looks like to actually pursue people in a godly manner. And we can help encourage one another to do this in a super amazing way. That is what I want y'all to take away from this book. That is what we're going to be going into. I'm sorry that this video was already way longer than it needed to be, but I hope that it's gotten you excited for this book because there is so much here to talk about. I'm so excited we're going to be going through this over the summer. Other than that, that's all I'm going to say. Thank you so much for watching this video. I don't know when you're watching this, but I hope you have a great rest of your day, rest of your evening, and I will see y'all Monday starting at 4 p.m. See y'all later. Be sure to keep a smile on your face, don't let anybody steal your joy, and remember who you are.